The biting wind tearing across Lake Michigan whipped through the shadowed avenues of Chicago, carrying with it a relentless flurry of snow that blanketed the city in a deceptive layer of pristine white. Beneath the flickering glow of a single struggling streetlight, a silent procession of heavily bundled figures stretched down the icy sidewalk leading toward the heavy wooden doors of the South Side Community Hope Center. These were the forgotten men and women of the city, their shoulders hunched against the biting cold, their eyes fixed firmly on the ground as they waited with desperate patience for a hot meal. Among this quiet crowd stood 28-year-old Chloe Davis, her slender frame shivering violently as she clutched her 3-year-old daughter Lily tightly against her chest. Chloe was desperate to transfer whatever fragile warmth remained in her own exhausted body to her child, hoping to shield her from the brutal, freezing reality of their existence. Lily was swallowed up in a bright pink winter coat that was easily 2 sizes too big for her, paired with a faded, mismatched woolen hat that Chloe had scavenged from a charity bin several weeks prior. The fabric of the little coat was frayed at the cuffs, worn thin by time and use, but Chloe had meticulously washed it in public bathroom sinks and carefully sewn a replacement button onto the collar using a stray piece of thread. The little girl clung to her mother's neck with an absolute unwavering trust. Her small mittened hands wrapped securely around Chloe's collar, as if that simple embrace was enough to keep the entire harsh universe at bay. Lily did not understand why they were standing outside in the dark, freezing night, nor did she comprehend the rigid tension radiating through her mother's freezing muscles. To the innocent child, simply being pressed against her mother's beating heart meant that everything in the world was perfectly safe and right. Chloe, however, felt every icy gust of wind as a personal failure, a sharp physical reminder of the terrifying precariousness of their lives. A mere 6 months ago, she could never have fathomed finding herself standing in a soup kitchen line, shivering in the freezing weather. Back then, she possessed a modest, warm apartment in a quiet neighborhood, a steady job working as a receptionist at a mid-sized dental clinic, and the fragile, comforting illusion that she had complete control over her future. Then, with terrifying speed and total silence, the foundation of her life completely crumbled beneath her feet. It began with the sudden termination from her job, a direct result of taking too many unpaid days off, when Lily's daycare abruptly closed down. Without a steady paycheck, the towering stack of past-due bills transformed into an insurmountable mountain of debt, leading to endless sleepless nights filled with quiet weeping. Finally, the devastating eviction notice was taped to her front door, reading like a final, unappealable death sentence. The man who had fathered Lily had abandoned them long before the financial ruin, vanishing into thin air the very week Chloe told him she was carrying a child. He had angrily demanded that she terminate the pregnancy, and when she steadfastly refused, he simply packed his bags and walked out the door forever. In the 3 years since his departure, there had been no phone calls, no letters, no child support, and absolutely no remorse. Chloe's own parents had passed away in a tragic highway collision when she was barely out of high school, leaving her entirely untethered from any extended family or safety net, long before she ever felt equipped to face the world alone. Devoid of family, drained of her meager savings, and completely lacking anyone to turn to for shelter, Chloe had slipped slowly, but inevitably, into a desperate existence she had previously believed was impossible. For several agonizing months, Chloe and Lily had survived by bouncing between crowded city shelters, securing a thin mattress on the floor, only on the rare occasions when there was an open space. On the many nights when the shelters were full, they were forced to seek refuge in the cramped back seat of Chloe's decaying rusted sedan, bundled together beneath a mountain of cheap thrift store blankets. To keep the terror at bay, Chloe would brightly tell Lily that they were embarking on a grand, secret adventure, pretending they were urban explorers camping beneath the towering steel trees of Chicago. She would force a wide smile, invent silly shadow puppet games against the frosted windows, and softly sing old lullabies to completely mask her own suffocating fear. But every single night, the moment Lily finally drifted into a peaceful slumber, Chloe would lie wide awake in the freezing dark, her heart painfully squeezed by the profound anxiety of failing to protect her only child from the cruelty of poverty. On this particular evening, however, the temperature had plummeted to nearly 0 degrees, rendering the metal shell of the car nothing more than a dangerous icebox. Even their thickest layers of blankets were no longer sufficient to stave off the threat of hypothermia. The community soup kitchen was absolutely their only viable option to survive the night. At the very least, Lily would consume a thoroughly hot, nourishing meal, and they could sit for a couple of hours within the protective embrace of 4 heated walls. The line of desperate souls shuffled forward at an agonizingly slow pace. Chloe gently adjusted the pink woolen hat on Lily's head, pulled the oversized collar up around the child's freezing ears, and began softly rubbing her daughter's tiny hands to generate a small amount of friction and heat. Immediately in front of them stood an elderly man named Arthur, a homeless veteran who had been a fixture on these streets for over a decade. He turned his weathered, deeply lined face toward them, offering a soft, toothless smile that crinkled the corners of his kind eyes. He reached into his deep, tattered pocket and produced a single, slightly crushed peppermint candy, holding it out to Lily with a trembling, heavily calloused hand. Chloe nodded her profound gratitude, allowing Lily to take the small offering, immensely touched by the extraordinary generosity of someone who possessed absolutely nothing. Raising her weary eyes, Chloe looked past Arthur toward the glowing frosted windows of the community center. Through the condensation and the intricate patterns of ice, she could clearly see the bustling volunteers inside, vigorously ladling steaming soup into large ceramic bowls and warmly conversing with the exhausted individuals seated at the long cafeteria tables. The golden light spilling onto the snowy pavement provided her with a complex mixture of immense relief and a deeply agonizing sense of personal shame. She was undeniably grateful that such assistance existed in the world, yet every single step forward in this wretched line served as a glaring, undeniable testament to just how far she had fallen from grace. As they finally crossed the threshold into the building, the sudden overwhelming wave of glorious heat caused Chloe to momentarily close her eyes and exhale a trembling breath. The interior of the community hall was chaotic and loud, filled with the clattering of metal spoons against ceramic bowls, the low murmur of dozens of conversations, and the rich, savory aroma of roasted chicken and root vegetables. Chloe opened her eyes, gently shifting Lily's weight on her hip, and prepared to shuffle forward toward the serving line. Then, during a seemingly mundane mechanical sweep of the vast room, her weary gaze suddenly froze. Standing directly behind the main serving counter, wearing a dark canvas apron over a sharply tailored, expensive wool sweater, was a man she recognized in a fraction of a second long before her rational mind could properly process the impossibility of his presence. Her lungs seized completely, cutting off her breath, and her exhausted heart completely skipped a heavy beat. Even after the passage of 10 long transformative years, she would have recognized his profile absolutely anywhere on Earth. He possessed the exact same dark, unruly hair, though it was now styled much shorter and with a highly sophisticated neatness. He had the exact same striking jawline, though his features had undeniably matured, trading boyish charm for a deeply grounded masculine assurance. He moved behind the counter with a calm, deliberate tranquility, radiating the unmistakable aura of a man who possessed immense wealth, authority, and the absolute certainty of his place in the world. He was wearing a dark, elegant watch that likely cost more than Chloe had earned in 2 full years of clerical work, an accessory that starkly contrasted with the worn, tattered coats of the hungry people eagerly taking food from his hands. It was Luke Mitchell. He was her very first love, the boy with whom she had spent countless golden afternoons during their high school years, the boy who had intimately shared her wildest dreams and most naive hopes for the future. He was the person with whom she had earnestly planned a complete, beautiful life, long before the heavy pressures of out-of-state universities, differing career trajectories, and the bitter reality of growing up had forced them onto entirely separate paths. For one agonizing, crystal-clear fraction of a second, the entire weight of her past came crashing down upon her shoulders. She remembered the melodic sound of his laughter echoing across the bleachers, the earnest promises they had whispered under the bleary stadium lights, and the absolute unshakable certainty they once held that absolutely anything was possible for them. Then, a blinding wave of sheer, unadulterated panic fiercely gripped her throat. She absolutely could not allow him to see her in this pitiful state. Not like this. Not as a homeless, destitute, violently shivering woman, holding a hungry child in a charity line simply to secure a free government-subsidized meal. She suddenly felt profoundly minuscule, entirely exposed beneath the harsh fluorescent lights, feeling as though every single ounce of her accumulated shame and failure was painted in bright, unavoidable colors across her tired face. Driven by pure instinctual humiliation, she immediately pivoted on her worn heels, prepared to drag Lily back out into the freezing, perilous night. It was in that exact, desperate moment of retreat that Lily finally reached her absolute breaking point. A sharp, piercing wail, heavily laden with pure exhaustion, bitter cold, and gnawing hunger, violently shattered the muffled hum of the dining hall. Lily buried her tear-streaked face deeply into the crook of Chloe's neck, her small hands frantically grasping at the worn fabric of Chloe's damp coat. Through heavy, racking sobs, the tiny girl cried out loudly, her voice echoing in the space. She pleaded that her tummy was hurting and her toes were too cold to walk. Chloe felt her throat instantly tighten with an unbearable, suffocating sorrow. She tightly rocked her daughter, whispering a stream of desperate, soothing promises into the child's ear, promising that everything would be okay, even though her own faith in those words had vanished months ago. She realized with crushing defeat that she simply could not run away now. She absolutely could not prioritize her own fragile, battered pride over the profound, immediate suffering of her innocent daughter. She had explicitly promised Lily a warm meal, and she was going to deliver it regardless of the agonizing humiliation it cost her. Slowly, with her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, Chloe turned back around to face the serving line. She kept her chin firmly tucked toward her chest, desperately praying to any higher power that would listen, that Luke would remain completely focused on his ladling, that he would not bother to look up, and that he certainly would not recognize the vibrant, ambitious young woman he had once deeply loved in the hollow, exhausted shell standing before him today. The line steadily moved forward by 2 paces. Then, another 3 steps. Chloe could feel the ambient heat of the kitchen slowly thawing the painful numbness in her frozen fingers. Lily's loud, piercing cries eventually subsided into quiet, exhausted sniffles, replaced by a low, continuous whimper of deep fatigue. When they finally stepped directly in front of the stainless steel counter, Chloe forcefully kept her eyes glued to the scuffed linoleum floor. Luke was standing a mere 3 feet away from her. He was holding a large silver ladle suspended over a massive steaming vat of rich vegetable soup. His physical movements were incredibly calm, highly precise, and completely methodical. Then, as if an invisible, electric tether suddenly pulled his attention away from the food, he paused. He slowly lifted his head. For a moment, the relentless ticking of the clock completely ceased. Their eyes locked across the short distance, and Chloe knew with absolute terrifying certainty that he had recognized her in an instant. She watched in paralyzing silence as a profound wave of sheer shock violently rippled across his handsome features, rapidly followed by a stunned, breathless disbelief, and finally, a surge of deep, overwhelming emotion that he clumsily struggled to mask. His mouth opened slightly, his lips parting as if he were desperately searching for words that simply refused to form. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, incredibly gentle, yet carrying the destructive force of a hurricane. He simply breathed her name. Hearing him pronounce it so tenderly sent a massive physical shockwave radiating through her exhausted body. Her chest tightened painfully, and her weakened knees threatened to completely buckle beneath her weight. She forced herself to swallow the heavy lump of sorrow in her throat. She whispered a quiet greeting, her voice brittle and fragile, acknowledging that it had indeed been a very long time. Lily, completely oblivious to the massive emotional earthquake occurring above her head, suddenly stopped whimpering and observed the strange man with bright, curious eyes. She stared at Luke exactly as a child observes any intriguing, unfamiliar giant, entirely unaware of the invisible crackling tension saturating the air between the two adults. Luke slowly tore his gaze away from Chloe's haunted eyes and looked down at the tiny girl bundled in the oversized pink coat. Immediately, the heavy, corporate hardness he carried completely melted away from his expression, replaced by an incredibly pure, radiant warmth. He softly asked who the little girl was. Chloe drew in a long, shaky breath, tightly gripping Lily's waist. She explained that this was her daughter Lily, and that she was exactly 3 years old. A genuine, profoundly moved smile slowly spread across Luke's face. He softly stated that she was incredibly beautiful. Those few simple words, delivered without a single trace of pity, judgment, or condescension, violently cracked open a heavy protective wall deep inside Chloe's guarded heart. Without saying another word, Luke reached for 2 large, deep bowls. He generously filled them to the absolute brim with the thick, steaming soup, deliberately adding 3 extra-large portions of fresh, crusty bread to a side plate, and carefully pushed the heavy tray across the metal counter toward her. He softly instructed her to take the table situated in the far back corner near the heavy brick radiator, noting that it was significantly warmer in that section of the hall. Chloe managed to murmur a faint, barely audible word of thanks. She grabbed the plastic tray with trembling hands and practically fled toward the back of the room, feeling absolutely certain that if she remained standing in front of him for 1 more second, she would completely collapse onto the floor and weep uncontrollably. She navigated through the crowded tables until she found the isolated corner he had mentioned. She carefully lifted Lily out of her heavy coat and settled the tiny girl onto a sturdy wooden chair. The very moment the first spoonful of warm broth touched Lily's lips, the child's entire demeanor transformed. She ate with an intense, quiet dedication, completely focused on the meal, as if this single bowl of soup was the absolute most important thing in the entire universe. Chloe sat silently watching her daughter eat her own stomach violently, twisting with a complex cocktail of profound relief and overwhelming sorrow. Nothing else mattered right now. For this brief, shining hour, Lily was warm, safe, and fed. Chloe was so completely absorbed in watching her child that she entirely failed to notice Luke stepping out from behind the serving counter and quietly walking across the dining hall. She only realized he was there when a tall, broad shadow suddenly fell across their small table. Startled, she looked up to see him gently placing a second smaller tray onto the wood. On it sat two massive steaming mugs of rich hot chocolate, topped with marshmallows, a small plate of frosted sugar cookies, and a completely brand new, incredibly soft brown teddy bear holding a tiny red heart. Luke kept his hands resting lightly on the edge of the table, his eyes full of a careful, measured kindness. He quietly explained that he thought the little one might enjoy a small surprise, quickly adding that he hoped Chloe did not mind the intrusion. Lily's exhausted eyes instantly lit up with the brilliance of 1,000 suns. She looked directly at Luke, her small voice squeaking with disbelief, and asked if the fluffy bear was truly for her. Luke offered her a remarkably gentle, reassuring smile and confirmed that the bear was entirely hers to keep. Lily enthusiastically grabbed the stuffed animal, burying her small face into its soft fur, and hugging it tightly to her chest, as if she had just been handed the most valuable treasure on earth. Without formally asking for permission, but completely lacking any sense of arrogant entitlement, Luke slowly pulled out the chair, directly across from Chloe, and sat down. He seemed to hesitate for a long moment, carefully studying her tired face as if he were carefully navigating through a field of fragile glass. He finally broke the silence, asking in a low, gentle tone if it would be all right for them to talk for a few minutes. Chloe stared at her calloused, weather-beaten hands resting on her lap. She offered a slow, reluctant nod. She genuinely had no idea where to even begin, nor did she possess the vocabulary to adequately explain the massive, terrifying abyss that firmly separated the bright, ambitious young girl she used to be from the hollow, exhausted, homeless woman she had unfortunately become. Luke leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees. He softly asked what had happened to her, mentioning that the last piece of news he had ever heard about her was that she was successfully building a career as an administrator at a prestigious downtown law firm. Chloe kept her eyes firmly glued to the table. She admitted that she had indeed worked there, right up until the exact moment she discovered she was pregnant. The heavy words began to slowly spill from her lips, tumbling out, as if they possessed a crushing physical weight. She explained that the father had immediately walked out, that her parents had already passed away, and that she was left entirely alone. She recounted her desperate struggle to perfectly juggle the demanding job, the astronomical costs of city daycare, and the endless pile of monthly utility bills. She explained how the crushing exhaustion had inevitably led to mistakes at the office, which eventually resulted in her losing the job entirely. She took a ragged, painful breath, her throat tightening as she described the futile, agonizing search for alternative employment that paid enough to cover both rent and childcare, ultimately culminating in their devastating eviction. Luke's complexion grew noticeably paler with every single sentence she spoke. She quietly confessed that they had spent the last several months bouncing between crowded shelters, and whenever the beds were full, they were forced to sleep inside her freezing car. She added that tonight, the weather was simply too brutal to survive in the vehicle. A heavy, suffocating silence settled heavily over their small corner of the room. Luke watched Lily happily playing with her new bear. His jaw clenched so tightly that a small muscle feathered angrily in his cheek. After a long, heavy silence, Luke finally asked about the man who had abandoned them, his voice laced with a deep, tightly controlled anger. Chloe numbly repeated that the man had demanded she get an abortion, and upon her refusal, he had vanished completely, never reaching out or offering a single dime of support in 3 full years. Luke briefly closed his eyes, taking a deep breath to firmly contain his rising fury. When he opened them again, he looked directly into Chloe's eyes with an intense, burning sincerity. He revealed that he actually funded this entire community center through his own private corporate foundation. He explained that he intentionally volunteered on the serving line every single week because he absolutely refused to forget how quickly and brutally life could turn against a person. Chloe stared at him, utterly stunned by the revelation of his incredible success and his profound generosity. He leaned slightly closer, his voice breaking with genuine emotion, telling her that if he had possessed even a single clue that she was suffering through this nightmare, he would have relentlessly searched the entire country to find her and help her. Chloe replied softly, pointing out that life had simply pulled them in entirely different directions, entirely severing their connection. Luke vehemently shook his head. He confessed that he had thought about her constantly over the past 10 years. He explained that, although he had achieved massive corporate success, accumulated significant wealth, and built multiple thriving companies from the ground up, he had never once managed to find another connection that even remotely resembled what they had shared. Tears violently stung the corners of Chloe's eyes, threatening to spill over. She desperately gestured to her ragged clothing and her tired face, begging him to truly look at her. She reminded him that she was currently homeless, relying on charity to feed her child, and vehemently insisted that she was absolutely no longer the bright, hopeful girl he had once loved. Luke slowly reached across the wooden table, deliberately placing his large, warm hand mere inches away from hers. He spoke with absolute, unwavering firmness, telling her that she was not broken in the slightest. He declared that she was an incredibly fierce, dedicated mother who was fighting a brutal war to perfectly protect her child against impossible odds. He then issued a simple, heartfelt plea. He asked her to simply let him help them. Chloe felt the heavy protective walls around her bruised heart begin to violently tremble. Her fierce, stubborn pride instantly demanded that she stand up, refuse his charity, and walk away into the cold. But for the very first time in what felt like a lifetime, someone was truly looking at her. Luke was not viewing her as a pathetic, broken problem that needed to be quickly solved, nor was he looking at her with the condescending pity usually reserved for the destitute. He was looking at her as a deeply valuable, fiercely strong human being who fundamentally mattered to him. And buried deep within her exhausted soul, a small, terrifyingly fragile seed of hope began to take root. She silently wondered if perhaps the universe had orchestrated this reunion not as a cruel joke, but as the miraculous beginning of a beautiful second chance. She stared at Lily, safely hugging the brown bear, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, she gave Luke a tiny nod of acceptance. The subsequent weeks rapidly transformed into a breathtaking, miraculous turning point in their turbulent lives. True to his absolute word, Luke swiftly arranged for them to move into a bright, fully furnished, and incredibly warm apartment located in a quiet, safe residential neighborhood on the north side of the city. He casually explained that he owned the building and that the specific unit had been sitting completely empty for over a year. He introduced them to Mrs. Higgins, the incredibly sweet elderly building manager who lived on the ground floor. Mrs. Higgins immediately took to Lily frequently, baking fresh oatmeal cookies and offering to watch the child whenever Chloe needed an hour to herself. When Chloe first watched Lily excitedly run across the thick living room carpet and gleefully jump onto a real, incredibly soft mattress in her very own brightly painted bedroom, something massive and deeply painful completely shattered within Chloe's chest. For the very first time in nearly a year, she collapsed onto the floor and wept with total, absolute abandon. They were not tears of paralyzing fear, but an overwhelming, cleansing flood of profound relief. Luke, however, did not merely provide them with a sturdy roof and quietly disappear into his busy corporate life. He became a steady, quietly supportive pillar in their daily routine. He patiently sat with Chloe at the kitchen table, meticulously helping her rebuild her professional resume. He carefully connected her with a close colleague named Sarah, an incredibly sharp but deeply empathetic career counselor who specialized in helping women transition back into the workforce. Sarah rigorously prepped Chloe for difficult interviews, completely restoring the young woman's shattered professional confidence. Through it all, Luke was a constant, reassuring presence, yet he never once pressured Chloe or demanded anything in return. He quickly learned all of Lily's adorable little habits, committing to memory her absolute favorite meals and the specific bedtime stories she relentlessly demanded every single night. 3 months after their miraculous reunion in the soup kitchen, thanks to Sarah's guidance and her own fierce determination, Chloe officially secured a highly stable, well-paying position as the senior office manager at a rapidly growing downtown marketing agency. On the exact afternoon she signed her employment contract, Chloe sat alone in her newly purchased reliable used car for nearly an hour, gripping the steering wheel as heavy tears of pure triumph streamed down her face. She was no longer merely surviving the brutal storms of life. She was finally, truly living again. When she received her very first substantial paycheck, she immediately invited Luke over for dinner. As the evening wound down, she nervously brought up the topic of officially paying him market rent, or perhaps finding a new apartment entirely on her own to fully prove her independence. Luke listened quietly, his dark eyes intensely focused on her face. When she finally stopped speaking, he reached out and gently took both of her hands in his. He softly asked her not to push him away out of a misplaced sense of pride. His voice trembled slightly as he confessed that he wanted her to stay not out of obligation, but because he was deeply, irrevocably in love with her. He admitted that he had fallen completely in love with her when they were 17 years old, and that his heart had never truly moved on. He added that his life felt incredibly empty whenever she and Lily were not around. Chloe stared deeply into his eyes, searching for any hidden trace of pity or superiority, but she found absolutely nothing but pure, unadulterated devotion. She realized that he had not just saved her, he had walked beside her while she saved herself. With tears welling in her eyes, she softly confessed that she loved him too, admitting that a piece of her soul had always belonged to him. 1 year later, they were joyfully married in a beautiful, intimate ceremony held directly inside the community center where their completely broken paths had miraculously crossed again. Lily served proudly as the most beautiful flower girl in the city, holding a massive bouquet of bright yellow daisies. Surrounded by wonderful friends like Mrs. Higgins, Sarah, and even Arthur from the soup kitchen line Luke legally adopted, Lily completely cementing them as a real, permanent family. In the years that followed, Chloe and Luke utilized their shared resources to establish a comprehensive, highly effective foundation entirely dedicated to supporting struggling single mothers, transforming her agonizing past trauma into a powerful beacon of hope for thousands of desperate women. Reflecting upon their incredible journey, one comes to intimately understand a profound, undeniable truth about the incredibly complex tapestry of the human experience. As we navigate the long, frequently arduous decades of our lives, society relentlessly conditions us to believe that true strength is synonymous with absolute unyielding independence. We are falsely taught that to be a capable, mature adult means bearing the heaviest, most crushing burdens entirely in silence, fiercely hiding our painful scars and our terrifying vulnerabilities behind a thick, impenetrable armor of stoic pride. Yet the deepest, most enduring wisdom harvested from the brutal trials of life reveals a remarkably different reality. Sometimes, the universe systematically strips away our comforting illusions of control, breaking us down to our absolute lowest point, not out of a sense of cosmic cruelty, but to fundamentally teach us what genuinely matters. When we find ourselves standing shivering in the darkest, coldest nights of our existence, entirely stripped of our pride and our resources, we are forced to confront the beautiful, terrifying necessity of human connection. To desperately ask for a helping hand when your knees are buckling beneath the agonizing weight of the world is never an embarrassing manifestation of weakness. Rather, it is one of the most profoundly courageous acts a human being can possibly execute. It requires immense, staggering bravery to look another person in the eyes and completely expose your desperate need. Furthermore, this journey intimately illuminates the true, unvarnished nature of authentic love. Genuine love is absolutely not a theatrical, momentary act of heroic rescue that places one person above another in a permanent hierarchy of gratitude and debt. Instead, true love is a quiet, steadfast partnership. It is the willing, patient companion who gracefully sits with you in the ashes of your completely ruined life, refusing to flinch at the sight of your profound despair. It is the gentle, steady hand that does not simply violently pull you out of the deep mud, but patiently helps you wash off the dirt, firmly reminding you of your own inherent, indestructible dignity, until you possess the strength to completely stand upright on your own 2 feet once again. Ultimately, it is through our deepest, most agonizing fractures that the brilliant healing light of compassion is finally able to enter our souls. By bravely allowing others to witness our absolute most vulnerable moments, we do not just magically heal our own deeply wounded hearts. We simultaneously grant them the magnificent sacred privilege of exercising their own profound humanity. In the end, we are never truly defined by the brutal depths to which we have tragically fallen, but rather by the beautiful, loving grace with which we allow ourselves to be lifted, and the subsequent fierce dedication with which we reach back down into the darkness to pull the next freezing soul into the warmth.